Right?
Yeah.
Interview with Tim Bowden, Slate 2, Film 2, Take 2.
I was in the Southeast Asian area as a foreign correspondent for the ABC from 1965 to mid-1967, and in the course of that time I spent about 3 months in Vietnam all told. On one occasion in 1966 I went out with the Marines on a 24-hour, what they called a search and destroy mission outside the Da Nang Air Base, which was in fact a kind of an American oasis in hostile territory. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese regulars were operating quite close to the perimeters of the airfield, and the Marines had the task of clearing the area, as it were. Now, these search and destroy missions were conducted in what was called a free fire zone or free fire area, and that meant, in American terms, that if there were any civilians there, any people living there, well, that was their bad luck. In their eyes, they shouldn't be there. Anyway, we went off with a couple of tanks leading our platoon, and I was told to walk in the tank tracks because that was one way of avoiding booby traps, and they'd had a chap killed a week or so before who'd stepped on a mine.
A journalist cameraman?
No, not a cameraman, just a Marine, a corporal. And we went along in this fashion for a while, and then we came to a small hamlet where I saw some of the Marines rounding up some elderly peasants in traditional black pyjamas, old women, old men, mostly old people, because there didn't seem to be many young people about. And then I saw them link their arms in a long line and walk in front of the tanks across the ground before the tanks went over the same ground.
What were they trying to do?
Well, this was the question I asked, and he said, oh, well, there might be mines here, so we're pushing these people ahead of us. And I said, well, it seems to me to be a bit rough. He said, oh no, it's not as bad as it seems, because they know where the mines are. The Viet Cong tell them where they are because they don't want them to waste them by stepping on them when they're ploughing their fields or something like that. Mm. So I accepted this explanation, and I was a bit shocked by it. But anyway, on we went, with all the subtlety, it seemed to me, of a charging elephant. I mean, it's sort of open savanna country with these two tanks rumbling along, and no way in the world that people wouldn't know, the opposing side wouldn't know we were there. And in about half an hour's time, one of the Marines said that they thought they saw the helmet of a hardcore, meaning a North Vietnamese regular, in a small village which was about half a mile away to our left. And so they opened up with the two tanks and started pumping shells into this collection of houses, including a pagoda, I noted. In fact, they sort of whooped and yelped with joy when they managed to knock a hole in the wall of the pagoda. And that wasn't quite enough for them. They decided to call in an artillery strike, which they could apparently bracket any particular area they wanted to, just in a, with a radio call. And in due course, all this high explosive came tumbling in, and with more whooping and hollowing. And to my horror, I saw what I thought was a small boy trying to lead a water buffalo to safety in the middle of all this high explosive. I didn't see him for long because it sort of all disappeared in a cloud of dust. And I said, the people there, I thought I saw a little boy and a water buffalo. And the sergeant said, well, they shouldn't be there, and anyway, every Vietnamese house has a bomb shelter in it, in the same way he said that an American home has a TV set.
And comment about that, putting the hearts and minds of the people, just a new sentence about that. Mm.
I suppose this is, this seemed to me to be at variance with the policy of winning the hearts and minds of the people, but I had to presume that they meant the hearts and minds of people who were living in other than free fire zones. I was still pondering about this when, about 10 minutes later, one of the Marines came up to me, and he was a tall, slow-speaking North Carolina boy, about 20 years old, and wearing a recoilless rifle, which is a rather fearsome weapon. And he came up and rather shyly said, I believe you're Australian. And I said, yes. And he said, well, could you tell me about work with handicapped children in Australia? I'm very interested in that, and I'd like to go to Australia perhaps after my term here, and do some work with handicapped children. And I was so stunned by this that I barely knew how to reply to him, because in a flash it had come to me that this was really what it was all about, that the American soldiers did not think of the Vietnamese civilians as people. And this seemed to explain in a way later the My Lai massacres and that type of operation. because they just didn't think they were people.
Is it a legitimate comment to say, too, that a lot of the journalists, cameramen themselves, didn't, in terms that they were just sideline observers of a lot of human suffering and pain, and they switched off to it after a while? It wasn't really people that they were filming going through all that suffering?
Well, you have to switch off to a certain extent. If you become emotionally involved in what you see, I think the same thing could be said of somebody going to Calcutta and walking along the street and seeing all the beggars. I mean, you just simply can't let yourself be emotionally involved to that extent. But I do think that some of us were at fault for not making more fuss about it at the time.
Mm. This was the war proved that technology couldn't win, and the Americans had the firepower, you've said. Have you got any comments at all about the media? The media also, this is the most sophisticated technological coverage of any war we've had, yet it seemed to fail to change the minds of people as well. Why?
Well, the television coverage had a sameness about it. You could film the aftermath of disaster in war. You could film burnt villages and bodies and bomb craters and things like that. But as far as filming the combat, well, the chances of a cameraman being in the right place at the right time, and if he was, actually being able to push his camera over the top of wherever he was hiding and filming something, was very remote. So what you got was a series of shots of people walking along on patrol and people jumping in and out of helicopters. In fact, we used to joke that you might as well keep a library of stock footage and of these sort of shots and save us the trouble of going out and getting them. But the blood didn't seep through. It didn't have any reality. Even showing mutilated children and awful injuries that soldiers get, in a funny way, this seemed to confirm people's political attitudes. It didn't affect their compassion.
Why?
I don't know. Well, maybe it's the unreality of television, or because you're watching something on the screen, you can cut yourself off emotionally. There's no doubt about it. If they'd smelt the smoke and heard the screams and seen the anguish on faces, I'm sure the people who used to thunder for the forces of right to triumph over the forces of evil, meaning communists and anti-communists, would perhaps, I hope, have felt differently about it. But certainly the television coverage didn't seem to have any effect on the resolve of those people to bring the war to some kind of a conclusion.
Talking about the very little frontline coverage or action footage, Neil Davis is obviously one person who did go into the front line and get that sort of coverage on film. Can you explain to him, since you know him so well, very close friends, why he does this?
Neil has a great deal of compassion. He's one of the most sensitive people I think I've ever met. He's a farm boy. He's brought up on a small hamlet in Tasmania called Sorel, and he told me once that he felt close to the land and its people. And he had an instinctive rapport, I think, with the peasants and the people of Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and the areas where he went. And he also went out with the South Vietnamese forces and was the only Western cameraman to continually do so. Some still photographers went, some journalists went, but Neil, who was in a sense important for history that he did, because he worked for Viz News, the international news agency, and so a good deal of their coverage came from the South Vietnamese side.
Knowing him as you do, though, can you explain why he goes into combat zones and risks his life time and again after he's been wounded, hospitalised 6 times and wounded at least seriously on 1 occasion?
Well, I think Neil himself would admit that there is a high about being in a frontline situation. Your adrenaline's pumping, you're living, you're absolutely alert and aware, and the comradeship of such situations is also extreme. People are depending on each other. It can be a very exhilarating situation, and I think Neil never ceased to feel that.
Did you think that's where he'll end up dying, on a battlefield?
He's been very lucky, but after all, he now knows more than any soldier that would have been or he knew more than any soldier who would have been fighting in that area after having been there for 10 years. Most soldiers are only there for 2 or 3 years at the most. So he knows when to take risks and not to take risks, and at the same time, a kind of intuition, I think, which can let you down. I mean, after all, he was very badly wounded by a mortar bomb.
It ultimately comes back to fate, then.
Fate, a bit of luck, and in his case, certainly courage.
Okay.